He had been lost in darkness for so long that even the memory of light had faded. His body was still, his breath slow and shallow, and time passed without meaning. But then something changed. A soft hum echoed around him, warm air moved over his face, and he felt the pull of life once again. His eyes blinked open. Blurred light spilled into his vision, and everything was strange and unfamiliar. He could not move much. His arms were weak, his legs felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. Machines surrounded him. The walls around him curved with smooth silver and faint blue light, glowing like the breath of something alive. This place was not Earth. It did not feel like any hospital he had ever known. His name was Eli, though it took him a few moments to remember that. His thoughts were heavy as if swimming through thick water. His last memory was fire and metal breaking apart a ship, then falling into endless sleep. And now he was here lying still inside a pod that had protected him for who knew how long. As his vision slowly cleared, he noticed someone beside him. A tall figure sat quietly nearby, watching him not with cold eyes, but with something gentler. This figure was not human. Its skin glowed faintly like silver under moonlight. Its eyes were large and deep and held something old and quiet. It wore a soft robe, and its hands were folded in its lap. It did not move until Eli finally whispered one word, asking who the figure was. The alien stood slowly and moved closer, speaking in a calm and melodic voice. Its words came through a translator device, but even without that, Eli felt their meaning. The alien said he was called Kale and that he had watched over Eli for 20 years. 20 years, the words hit Eli like a storm. He had been asleep in a coma for that long, drifting between life and death while time outside moved on. He tried to sit up, but his body was too weak. Kale reached out and helped him, gently placing pillows behind his back and adjusting the bed so Eli could sit without pain. The alien's hands were steady and careful, as if this moment had been imagined many times before. Eli looked at him closely, trying to understand why someone not human would stay with him all this time. He asked questions slowly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Why did Kale stay here? What did he want? Was he a scientist or some kind of doctor from another world? Kale only smiled softly and shook his head, saying he was not here because of orders or science. He had stayed for a reason deeper than duty. Eli's body ached, but his mind started to awaken. He remembered fragments of the crash. The mission had gone wrong. They had been searching for something out beyond the safe borders of human space. Then there had been the explosion and the screams, and then nothing. Kale brought him water in a thin crystal cup, and Eli drank slowly, tasting something clean and slightly sweet. As he drank, Kale spoke again, saying that the war had ended long ago, that peace had returned to most parts of the galaxy, but that Eli had been forgotten by his own kind. The ship they had shared had been considered lost, with no survivors reported. Kale had gone against his own people's decision by taking Eli to safety, keeping him alive using both alien and human medical technology. For 20 years he had kept watch, keeping the machines working, keeping Eli's body from giving up completely. Eli looked at him with new eyes, then trying to feel something beyond confusion. This being had waited for him, had sacrificed time and freedom for someone not even of his species. That thought stirred something inside him, something warm and painful at the same time. Kale spoke again, this time, his voice softer than before, saying that during the first years of the coma, Eli had sometimes spoken out loud in his sleep. He had called for help. He had whispered words of pain and hope, and sometimes had spoken directly to Kale, not knowing he was there. He had called Kale his friend in those broken moments. Those words had stayed with Kale. They had changed something in him. He said that at first he had watched over Eli because it was the right thing to do, because no one should die alone in the coldness of space. But over time he had come to care for Eli not just as a patient, but as a person, someone who had shown kindness before the crash, someone who had once saved Kale's life during a moment of danger that had been forgotten by others, but not by him. Eli listened quietly, breathing deeply. His heart was heavy, but there was also something new inside him, a quiet fire starting to burn. He looked around the room again, this strange and silent place that had kept him alive. He was not sure what future waited for him outside this ship. He did not know what Earth looked like now, or if anyone even remembered his name. But Cale had remembered. Cale had stayed. And that meant something. That meant everything. The silence stretched for a while then. Cale spoke once more, saying that Eli would need time to heal, but that he was not alone. Not anymore. And then he added a sentence that stayed in Eli's mind long after he closed his eyes again. He said, "I did not stay because of duty, I stayed because of who you are." And with that, Eli drifted back into sleep, not the sleep of coma or forgetting, but the gentle rest of someone who has been found and is finally starting to wake up again. The next time Eli opened his eyes, the light was softer, and his body felt a little stronger, though still unfamiliar, like something borrowed from another life. He turned his head slowly and saw Cale sitting beside him again, just as calm and quiet as before, but now there was something different in the way Eli looked at him, something deeper, something that reached beyond words. Cale helped him sit up more comfortably and brought him a bowl of warm broth that had a gentle flavor like herbs. From another world, Eli sipped slowly, feeling life returning piece by piece, as if every swallow pulled him further away from the shadows of coma and closer to memory and meaning. His thoughts were still slow but clearer than before, and his voice, though quiet, carried more weight when he asked about the world outside and what had happened while he slept. Cale sat in silence for a moment, as if choosing carefully which truth to share first. Then he began speaking gently, telling Eli that the galaxy had shifted while he was lost in sleep. Earth was no longer the center of bold missions and fearless expansion. Instead, it had become cautious, quiet, part of a fragile alliance held together by uneasy peace and unspoken history. The stars that once promised adventure now carried shadows of war and regret. Eli closed his eyes as Cale spoke, letting the truth settle inside him like cold air in the lungs. He had gone to space as part of a mission to seek knowledge, to discover ancient signals buried deep in unexplored space, and to prove that humanity could walk beside other civilizations with pride and peace. But something had gone wrong. His ship had fallen, his crew was gone, and now he was the only one left from that forgotten journey. As Cale continued, he brought out a small device and placed it near Eli. A soft blue light flickered, and a projection appeared showing images of a younger Eli and his crew laughing inside the mission ship before the crash. There were voices, two echoes from the past, captured by the ship's memory. Eli watched without speaking, his face pale as he saw the people he had once worked with, joked with, trusted, and lost. One moment stood out above the rest. A recording from just before the explosion. The ship shaking, alarms blaring, and Eli yelling for the crew to move, for someone to seal the chamber, for someone to save themselves, even as he stayed behind to shut down the failing core. It was this moment that Cale paused on, letting the image hang in the air, showing Eli's choice to protect others, even when it meant facing death. Eli stared at his younger self and felt the weight of everything he had forgotten now return to him like a flood. The silence between him and Cale stretched, not in discomfort, but in understanding. Then Cale turned off the device and spoke with a voice that held both respect and sorrow, saying that after the crash he had found Eli barely alive with injuries no human doctor could have healed, but Cale had carried him from the wreckage through dangerous terrain and hidden him from others who wished to erase what had happened. Eli was confused by that. Why would anyone want to erase a failed mission? Was it not just an accident? Was it not just space being cruel and cold? Cale looked at him then, with eyes that carried the weight of secrets, and said that the truth was never simple. The mission had uncovered something powerful, something ancient that some did not want others to find. There were records buried beneath that planet, not just of alien history, but of connections that could change everything about how humans saw themselves and the galaxy. The discovery had scared those in power, both human and alien, and it was easier to say the crew was lost to a crash than to explain the truth. Eli had been a threat, not because he was dangerous, but because he refused to lie. He had tried to send a warning before the crash, had tried to protect the data, had tried to reach Earth with a message, but someone had made sure that message never arrived. As the room grew quieter, Eli turned his head toward the window where a slow stream of stars passed like whispers across the sky. He felt no anger, only a deep sadness and confusion at how easily people had chosen silence over truth, but he also felt something else. A slow, steady fire returning to him, the part of him that had once believed in purpose and in standing up even when the cost was great. He looked at Cale again and asked softly why he had not told him all this before. Cale replied that Eli had needed time to heal, to remember who he was before facing the weight of what had happened. And now that he was strong enough, it was time to decide what came next. Before he could answer, Cale touched another panel, and the walls of the room shifted, revealing a small garden built in the center of the ship. It was unlike anything Eli expected, not cold and mechanical, but full of color and life, glowing flowers that moved with the rhythm of the air, gentle vines that wrapped around soft light beams, and water that flowed without gravity, floating in perfect shapes. Cale explained that he had built this place to remind Eli of Earth and to keep hope alive during the long years of waiting. Eli stepped forward with effort, walking slowly on legs that remembered movement only in dreams, and stood among the glowing plants. He reached out and touched a petal that shimmered with warmth and light, and in that moment he felt the first real peace he had known in a long time. He was not just alive, he was awake, and someone had waited for him, not out of duty or order, but out of something far more rare and beautiful. He turned to Cale and asked what they should do now, and Cale only answered with a calm voice, saying that soon Eli would have to choose between silence and truth, between safety and purpose, and that whatever he chose, Cale would not leave his side. The moment was quiet, but heavy with meaning, and Eli knew deep inside that his journey was no longer about the past, but about what came next. Garden lights faded slowly into the soft glow of artificial dusk as Eli sat beneath a wide-leafed plant that swayed gently. Even without wind, he had walked more that day than he had in weeks. His steps, slow but steady, each one proving to himself that he was not a ghost, not a forgotten name from an old mission file. He was real, he was here, and the memories coming back to him were no longer just pieces of pain, but pieces of truth. Cale stood nearby, watching silently like a guardian who had learned the value of patience. He spoke only when Eli was ready, never pressing, never rushing, and in this quiet, Eli found comfort. Something he had never expected to feel on a ship so far from the home he barely remembered. They walked together down one of the upper corridors, where the walls were lined with smooth surfaces that flickered with data maps glowing slightly as if the ship itself was alive. Cale explained that the vessel had once been part of a larger fleet, a medical and research group that had scattered after the Great Council War ended. Some of the others had moved on and some had vanished, but Cale had stayed here alone with one task: to keep Eli alive no matter what. Eli asked him why again, this time not as a patient, but as someone beginning to understand the gravity of what he had been through. Cale paused, then placed his hand on the panel near a sealed chamber, and slowly the door opened. Inside was a small room filled with preserved logs, memory drives, and old mission gear, all carefully arranged, all kept like a shrine to a life. Paused in time, Cale stepped inside and picked up an old suit, the one Eli had worn before the crash. It still carried marks from the fire damage and battle scarring, but it had been cleaned and folded as if waiting for its owner to return. Cale looked at it for a long time, then turned to Eli and said, there had been a time during the mission when Cale had nearly died, and Eli had saved him not just through action, but through compassion and instinct. During a joint operation on a storm-covered moon, Cale had been injured, caught under falling wreckage, while others ran for safety, and Eli had gone back alone, pulling Cale out, carrying him through acid rain and debris until they reached shelter. It had not been part of the mission, it had not been a command, it had been a choice, one that Cale had Never forgotten from that moment, Cale had believed there was something in humans worth protecting, not because they were perfect, not because they were powerful, but because they had the ability to choose kindness, even when it was not expected, and Ayla had been proof of that. Eli listened in silence, his throat tight with emotion, as he remembered the mission. Cale described the cold rain, the metal tearing the screams, and the weight of the alien he had pulled to safety. He had done it without thinking, just as he would for any teammate. But for Cale, it had meant something greater. It had been a moment that connected two lives in a way neither could undo. Their quiet conversation was broken by a sharp sound, a soft pulse from the console. Cale moved quickly, pressing commands and opening a feed. Strange signals were echoing through space, directed at their ship, rhythmic and repeated like someone knocking from a distance. Not a distress call and not a standard beacon, but something meant to be noticed. Cale examined the patterns, and his expression changed, slowly becoming tense. Eli asked what it meant, and Cale told him that someone knew. Ayla had awakened, someone had found their location, and it was not a message of welcome. Eli felt his breath catch. The idea of being hunted after all this time made the air feel heavier. Cale brought up a star map showing a vessel approaching, a human warship, not from Earth's current peacekeeping fleet, but from one of the old sectors, the ones rumored to still operate under private orders and hidden motives. Eli understood then that his survival was not just a forgotten miracle, but a threat to someone's secret. He had lived through something he was not meant to remember, and now they were coming to finish what had been started 2 decades ago. Cale looked at him with calm certainty, saying he had been preparing for this moment for years, that he had built defenses, that the ship had hidden layers and fail-safes meant for more than healing. Eli asked why Cale had never left, why he had stayed even when it became dangerous, and Cale answered with the same quiet honesty that had carried through every moment of their time together. He said it was not just about repayment. It was about belief that Eli had not just survived for nothing, that there was still something important left, to do something only he could. Finished, they moved to the command center, a space rarely used, its screens lighting up with activity. As systems reactivated around them, Cale moved with purpose, activating shielding protocols and silent weapon systems. Eli watched him work and felt something change inside him, a slow fire rising from the ashes of his forgotten years. He was tired. His body not what it used to be, his mind still catching up with the present. But none of that mattered now, because someone had waited for him. Someone had protected him, and someone had believed that his life still meant something. As the ship moved, slightly adjusting its orbit, the stars outside shimmered, and the approaching signal grew stronger. They had little time left and many questions still unanswered, but Eli felt no fear, only a quiet resolve. He turned to Cale and asked if they could stop the warship, if they could reveal the truth that others had tried to bury. Cale looked at him, then nodded and said it would not be easy, but truth never was, and this truth had waited long enough. And so the two of them stood in that small, quiet ship orbiting the edge of forgotten space, a human who had once chosen compassion, and an alien who had never let that choice be forgotten, now preparing for whatever would come next. Warship was still far from them, but its signal had become stronger and clearer, moving with steady purpose through the stars, like a shadow that refused to be ignored. Eli stood beside the control panel, watching its slow approach, the same way a storm creeps over a horizon, not fast but full of warning. He felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with the weight of something unfinished, something waiting to be faced. Cale worked in silence, checking systems, sealing doors, powering defense layers that had stayed hidden for 2 decades. His movements were sharp and careful, and though his face remained calm, there was something different in his eyes, now something that spoke of memories long buried, but never forgotten. Eli finally broke the silence and asked why the humans would come after him, now after all this time, and Cale looked at him with a pause, as if measuring how much truth to share. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady, saying that there was something Eli needed to see, something that had been locked away since the crash. They walked to a secure room deep within the ship, one that Eli had never entered before. The door opened only when Cale placed his hand on the reader, and inside the room was dark, except for a single console glowing faintly with green light. Cale stepped forward and opened a hidden file, a file labeled with the mission's original name and something else, something Eli had never seen before. The screen came to life, showing documents, video logs, audio recordings, all taken during the mission, before and during the crash. Cale played one of the recordings, and suddenly the past filled the room. Eli's voice echoed through the speakers, and behind it the voices of others, crew members, scientists, and commanders, all speaking with urgency and fear. They had discovered something below the surface of that forgotten planet, not just ruins or alien remains, but a technology so ancient and complex that even Cale's people had feared it. A vault buried beneath ice and stone, still active, still pulsing, with unknown power, and more importantly, it responded to human presence. Eli had been the first to touch it, and something inside had opened for him. The mission commander had panicked, fearing what this could mean, fearing the reaction from Earth's leadership if it became known that humans might have a link to something older than the Council itself. Some believed it proved humans were special, others feared it would bring war again, and so a decision was made, a quiet decision among those in power, to make sure the discovery would never leave that planet. The explosion that caused the crash had not been random. It had not been a systems failure as the reports claimed. It had been ordered from someone above, sent as a signal to remove a problem before it grew, and Eli had been part of that problem. Eli stared at the screen, unable to speak, his hands clenched tightly at his sides as the truth settled like iron in his bones. He had always felt there was something wrong about the way the crash had happened, but to know it had been planned, to know people had chosen silence over discovery, it filled him with a fire he had not felt in years. Cale closed the file and turned toward him, saying that the people who had ordered the silence were still out there, still holding power, and now that they knew Eli had survived, they would not hesitate to finish what they started, unless Eli stopped them, unless he spoke the truth. Eli looked at him then and asked what good the truth would do now, after so much time had passed, after the galaxy had moved on, and Cale answered that the truth was never about timing, it was about justice and healing, and the right to remember what others tried to erase. Outside the window, the warship had come closer, its form now visible, a sharp and armored shadow against the stars. Cale confirmed that its weapons were active, that its shields were raised, and that they had not responded to any peaceful message. Their goal was not to talk, but to remove a threat before it became too loud. Eli paced slowly, the gravity of the moment pulling at his every thought. He had just woken from a sleep that stole 20 years, and now he was being asked to risk everything again, not just for himself, but for those who would come after, who might never know the truth if he remained silent. He looked at Cale and asked what choice they had, and Cale replied that they had to escape and hide far beyond known space, living quiet lives in safety, or send a signal to the Council revealing everything and preparing to defend themselves until help arrived, if it ever did. Eli stood still for a long time, then slowly stepped toward the main console, his fingers hovering over the controls, the memory of his younger self flashing through his mind, the man who once chose to save a life instead of saving himself. And he realized that man still lived inside him, that the choice was already made. He turned to Cale and said, "If this truth matters, then we cannot hide, not again, not now." And Cale nodded with quiet pride. Before activating the ship's long-range broadcast system together, they prepared the message, loading the files, the recordings, the proof of betrayal and truth. And when the message was ready, Eli pressed the final command and watched as the signal was released into the stars, traveling toward the Council and every listening ear in between. Ship shook slightly, a distant rumble from the approaching warship's engines growing louder, but inside their small vessel, there was no fear, only readiness. Cale stood beside Eli and said, "Whatever happens now, we face it together." And Eli gave a small nod, not as a soldier, not as a hero, but as someone who remembered who he was. Somewhere deep in the silence of space, the truth finally began to travel free at last. Moment the message was sent into the stars, something shifted in the space around them. The silence that had surrounded the ship for so long was broken, not by sound but by the presence of something that could no longer be hidden. The warship outside responded. Quickly, its systems growing active as energy rippled along its hull. Its engines glowed brighter, its weapons hummed with power, and its intent was clear. There would be no discussion, no delay, only destruction inside the small medical vessel. Eli stood with his hands steady, his heart beating with his strength. He had not felt since before the crash. He knew what he had done, and he had no regret. The truth had finally been released. The voices of those who had been lost were now free to be heard, and no matter what came next, that could not be undone. Cale remained at his side, silent but alert, his tall form calm, even as the ship trembled. With the distant echo of the enemy drawing closer, they had no fleet, no army, no reinforcements, only each other, and the old systems of a ship meant for healing, not battle. But Cale had spent years preparing, quietly building layers of defense hidden behind the soft lights and clean walls. There were shields that could bend light, there were pulses that could distort signals, and there were traps left behind by engineers who once believed that even healers must know how to protect. Eli moved to the command panel and activated the internal systems, watching as screens lit up with information he could barely understand. But Cale guided him step by step, showing him which switches to press, which controls to slide, and together they prepared. As much as they could, the enemy would arrive in minutes, and when it did, there would be no second chances outside. The stars seemed to dim as the warship loomed closer, its size massive compared to their vessel, like a blade pointed at a feather, and yet inside the medical ship there was no fear, only purpose. Eli knew that even if they did not survive, the truth had already been set free. The Council would receive the message, and with it the records of betrayal and silence, the ancient technology, the buried vault, the orders given to erase it all, and most of all the story of a man who had tried to protect knowledge and nearly died for it. Cale moved to the side control board and opened communication lines, not to speak, but to flood the incoming signal with static, buying them more time. The enemy began to scan their ship, searching for weaknesses. But Cale had prepared for that. 2 false signals ran through the system decoys, hiding their real location on board and slowing down the enemy response. Then the first pulse hit, a wave of energy shaking the walls of their ship and making the lights flicker. Cale reinforced the shields, and Eli braced himself against the railing. The impact was strong, but not fatal. Their systems held. Cale turned to Eli and gave a nod, not of fear, but of readiness. Another pulse came, this one sharper, stronger, but still the ship endured. Eli looked at the screen showing the enemy warship and saw that its weapons were not designed to destroy immediately. They were trying to disable, trying to take the ship intact, perhaps to erase the message before it spread, perhaps to capture Eli and silence him for good. Eli stepped forward and activated the last protocol. Cale had shown him a core defense module built into the ship's heart, something designed not for battle but for survival. It created a short burst of light and gravity, a wave that could push back even a larger vessel for just a moment, and that moment was all they needed. Cale aligned the system. Eli gave the signal, and the core activated. The wave expanded outward like a breath made of stars, and the enemy ship shifted its balance, rocked slightly, and pulled back just enough for the final message packet to reach full transmission. The signal broke through jamming and interference, racing through space and reaching relay points that would carry it across entire sectors. Had done it. The truth was out. The Council would see, the records would be verified, the cover-up would be exposed, and those who tried to erase the past would have to answer for what they had done. But the warship was not finished. It recovered fast and now powered its main weapons, preparing to end what had begun 2 decades ago. Cale looked at Eli, and without speaking, they both understood this would be the final moment. There was no more running, no more hiding, only one last stand, not to fight, but to remain unbroken. The ship trembled again. A deep rumble filled the walls. Eli closed his eyes. Not in fear, but in peace. He had remembered who he was. He had spoken for those who could not. And he had found in Cale not only a protector, but a true friend. Then, Something unexpected happened. Another signal appeared on the edge of their sensors. Faint but clear, it was not the warship, it was not an echo, it was a response. The Council had received the message and sent a peace cruiser faster than expected, arriving just in time. The warship detected it and hesitated, not prepared for a confrontation. In public, not prepared to face judgment with witnesses, a communication line opened from the Council cruiser warning the warship to stand down. The enemy ship paused, its weapons powered down, and without another word, it turned and slowly retreated, vanishing into the stars like a shadow melting into silence. Inside the medical vessel, Eli collapsed into the chair, his strength nearly gone but his spirit full. Cale sat beside him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder, and for a long time, they said nothing, only watched the stars slowly return to stillness. The days that followed the Council investigation confirmed everything. Eli had revealed the hidden orders, the sabotage, the lost technology, and the lives taken to protect a secret, and slowly trust began to shift. The galaxy learned of Eli's courage and of the alien who had guarded him without reward, and people from many worlds listened to their story. Eli was offered a place on Earth, again not as a forgotten name, but as someone who had returned with purpose, and Cale was welcomed as a guest of honor, the one who never gave up on a friend, no matter how long the silence lasted. As the ship approached Earth for the first time in 20 years, Eli stood at the window, looking down at a blue world he had once left behind, but now it felt different. No longer a place of failure, but a place where something new could begin. He turned to Cale and gave a quiet smile, and for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to live, not as someone lost in time, but as someone who had returned with truth. Deep in his heart, he knew the past had been painful and heavy, but it was the loyalty of one alien who had kept him alive, and that loyalty had turned a forgotten man into a voice that reached across the stars. The end.